This story begins with a contract, one that was never meant to turn into love. But fate has its own plans. Elena Carter made a promise to herself. This marriage was just a deal. No feelings, no love, no weakness. But when Adrian Knight's touch burned with possession, when his eyes darkened with something dangerous, everything changed. Adrian had always been a man of control. Yet, ever since Elena entered his life, he found himself fighting the urge to hold her, to claim her, to never let her go. It was just a contract. But now, Elena Carter had made a promise to herself. This marriage was just a contract. She wouldn't feel, she wouldn't fall, she wouldn't let Adrian Knight break her. But after that kiss, after the way his lips had claimed hers, the way his hands had held her like she belonged to him, her world was no longer the same. And neither was his. Adrian Knight never lost control. But since that night, he hadn't been the same. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. Every time he walked into a room, he searched for her. Every time another man looked at her, he wanted to tear the world apart. But this wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to matter. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pushed her away. For the next few days, Adrian ignored her. No lingering glances, no conversations, no accidental touches. Just silence. Elena tried to tell herself she didn't care, that the kiss had been a mistake, that whatever had passed between them wasn't real. But late at night, she couldn't stop remembering the way he had looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered. And she hated herself for wanting him to look at her like that again. The tension between them was unbearable, so when Elena was invited to a fashion charity event, she decided to go. She needed a distraction, a way to remind herself that there was a world outside of Adrian Knight. And that's when she met Lucas Carter. Lucas Carter was charming, confident, and completely interested in Eleanor. And unlike Adrian, he didn't hold back. "You're different from the women in this world," Lucas said, offering her a glass of wine. "That's why I noticed you." Eleanor smiled, trying to ignore the fact that she was thinking about someone else. But just as she reached for the glass, a strong hand wrapped around her wrist. Her breath hitched, because she knew exactly who it was. Adrian's grip tightened. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark and furious. "Eleanor," he said, voice low, dangerous. She swallowed hard. "What are you doing?" He ignored her, turning to Lucas. "She's not interested," Adrian said flatly. Lucas raised an eyebrow, smirking. "And who are you to decide that?" Adrian's gaze turned deadly. "I'm her husband." Silence. Eleanor's heart stopped, because for the first time, Adrian had claimed her. Not as a contract, not as a business arrangement, but as his. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. "Right. Well, when she realizes she deserves better, she knows where to find me." Then he walked away, and suddenly, they were alone. Adrian still hadn't let go of her wrist. "Elena," he murmured. She snapped. "What the hell was that?" she hissed, yanking her wrist free. Adrian's eyes were still dark with something dangerous. "You don't need to talk to men like him," Elena laughed bitterly. "Oh? And who do I talk to, Adrian? My cold, distant husband who pretends I don't exist." His jaw tightened. "Elena? No." She took a step closer, her chest rising and falling with rage. "You kissed me," she whispered. "And then you pretended it never happened. And now you're acting like you have the right to control who I talk to." Adrian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand," he muttered. Her voice broke. "Then make me understand." Silence. For a long moment, he just stared at her, like he was battling something inside himself. Then he grabbed her. His lips crashed onto hers, hard, desperate, uncontrolled. Eleanor gasped, her hands slamming against his chest, but he didn't let go. His fingers tangled into her hair, his body pressing against hers, taking everything he had denied himself. She should have pushed him away. She should have stopped him. But she melted. Because this wasn't just a kiss. This was a war. And neither of them wanted to win. When he finally pulled away, their foreheads touched, their breathing ragged. "Eleanor," he whispered, voice raw. Her fingers clenched his jacket. "Tell me this is nothing," she whispered. "Tell me this doesn't mean anything." Adrian swallowed hard, and then he did the one thing she never expected. He let her go, stepped back, and whispered, "I can't." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor shattered, leaving himself completely broken, because the truth was out now. And Adrian Knight was in too deep. A billionaire and a girl from the streets, now bound together in something that was never supposed to be real. But as Adrian Knight slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch lingering just a second too long, something inside him shifted. Something dangerous. Something unpredictable. And neither of them had any idea that this marriage of convenience would soon turn into something neither of them ever expected. Elena Carter had always imagined what it would feel like to step into a world of wealth and power. But as she stood inside Adrian Knight's mansion, she realized it was nothing like the fairy tales. Cold marble floors stretched beneath her feet, polished so perfectly they reflected the golden chandeliers above. The air smelled of luxury, but not warmth. The house was massive, yet it felt empty, like its owner, like her new husband. Adrian stood near the grand staircase, his hands in his pockets, his grey eyes as unreadable as ever. "This is your home now," he said simply. But there was no emotion in his voice, no welcome, no softness, just a statement, a contract, and nothing more. Eleanor followed him through the mansion as he led her to her new room. She tried not to feel overwhelmed by the sheer size of the house, the number of servants bowing as they passed, the way everything was too perfect, too lifeless. Finally, Adrian stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. A bedroom, lavish, stunning, bigger than her entire apartment. She turned to him, confused. "This isn't your room?" she asked. Adrian leaned against the doorframe, his expression completely unreadable. "We won't be sharing a room." Eleanor's breath caught. She knew this was a contract marriage. She knew this wasn't real, but hearing him say it so coldly still stung. Adrian continued, his voice clipped and businesslike. "There are rules, Elena." She clenched her jaw. "What kind of rules?" Adrian's rules: 1, no love. 2, no personal involvement. 3, no touching. 4, you play the role of my wife in public, nothing more. "Do you understand?" he finished, his gaze sharp. Eleanor's hands tightened into fists. Her heart screamed at her to run, to walk away. But it was too late. She had signed the papers. She had chosen this. So she lifted her chin, met his gaze head on, and nodded. "I understand." Days passed. Eleanor lived in a mansion filled with people, but she had never felt so alone. Adrian left early in the morning, returning only late at night. Their interactions were minimal. Brief exchanges, clipped words, emotionless silence. The world thought they were a newlywed couple. But behind closed doors, they were nothing more than strangers. But things started changing. It was subtle at first. The way Adrian's eyes lingered on her when she wasn't looking. The way he hesitated before walking past her. The way his cold exterior cracked, just slightly, whenever she challenged him. And then, the night everything changed. The storm raged outside, rain pounding against the glass windows. Elena tossed and turned in bed, the sound of thunder rattling through the empty mansion. Her heart pounded. She had hated thunderstorms since she was a child. But tonight, she was alone. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ignore the fear. And then, a sudden crack of thunder shook the walls. A startled gasp left her lips. And before she could stop herself, she ran. Adrian had just finished reviewing business reports in his office when his door flew open. Eleanor stood there, breathless, eyes wide with fear. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, she exhaled shakily. I'm sorry, she whispered. Her voice faltered. Adrian's gaze softened, just slightly. He saw it then. The slight tremble in her hands. The way her lips were pressed together, trying to be brave. Something inside him shifted. Without a word, he stepped aside. Stay, he murmured. Eleanor hesitated, but then another clap of thunder shook the house. And this time, she stepped inside. The room was silent except for the sound of the rain. Eleanor sat stiffly on the edge of the couch. Adrian leaned back in his chair, watching her with an expression he didn't even understand himself. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was charged. Finally, after what felt like forever, Adrian exhaled. You hate storms, he murmured. It wasn't a question. Eleanor swallowed hard. Always have. Another silence. Then, Adrian did something that shocked them both. He stood up, walked toward her, and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Eleanor froze. Her heart raced. For a man who was supposed to be cold and untouchable, his touch was warm. I don't need your help, she whispered, even as she pulled the blanket tighter. Adrian smirked, shaking his head. Sure you don't. And in that moment, neither of them realized the walls between them had already begun to fall. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Eleanor slept in his presence. And when Adrian woke up the next morning, she was still there, curled up on the couch, peaceful, as if for the first time in a long time. She felt safe. And as Adrian watched her, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, something dangerous, something uncontrollable. He clenched his jaw. This was a contract. This was not real. But as he reached forward just for a second, his fingers brushed against her cheek. And for the first time, Adrian Knight wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, because he was breaking his own rule. He was falling. Adrian Knight was not a man who lost control, not in business, not in power, and certainly not in emotions. But ever since Elena Carter walked into his world, something inside him had started to shift. He told himself it was nothing, just curiosity, just an inconvenient distraction, just a contract. But the way his fingers had lingered on her cheek that night, the way he had caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, it was dangerous. And Adrian Knight had never been afraid of anything. Until now. Days passed. Elena tried to ignore the way Adrian had changed. He wasn't as cold. He wasn't as distant. And sometimes, she caught him staring, like he was trying to figure her out, like he was trying to fight something inside himself. She should have been happy. But something about it terrified her, because if Adrian felt something for her, it would be so much harder when this ended. The world still thought they were a perfect newlywed couple. So when a high-profile charity gala was hosted by one of Adrian's business associates, they had to go. Eleanor didn't expect much. She would play the role of his wife. She would smile, nod, pretend. She would blend into the background. But Adrian had other plans. She wasn't sure when it started. Maybe it was when she had stepped into the ballroom, wearing a black silk gown that clung to her like a second skin. Maybe it was when he had placed his hand on her lower back, guiding her through the crowd, his touch possessive, firm. Or maybe it was when she laughed, not at him, not because of him, but because of another man. He watched as Daniel Parker, a young investment banker, leaned in too close. His hand brushed against her arm. His lips curled into a playful smile. And Eleanor laughed. Adrian's jaw tightened. His grip around his glass turned deadly. And before he could stop himself, he moved. Eleanor felt the warmth first, the sudden heat of a hand gripping her waist. Then the unmistakable scent of Adrian's cologne. She barely had time to react before his deep voice rumbled against her ear. "Is he entertaining you, sweetheart?" Eleanor's breath caught. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Oh, Adrian, we were just—" Adrian's grip tightened. His lips curled into a slow, dangerous smirk. "Just leaving, weren't you?" Daniel hesitated. But one look into Adrian's darkening grey eyes, and he knew. This was not a fight he would win. With a forced laugh, he excused himself. And just like that, Eleanor was alone with Adrian. Adrian didn't let go. His fingers still burned against her skin. "Elena," he murmured, voice low, controlled. Her heart raced. "You have no right to be jealous," she whispered. His gaze sharpened. "Who said I was jealous?" Eleanor swallowed hard. His hand slid from her waist to her wrist, slow, deliberate. Then he pulled her closer, so close she could feel the heat of his breath against her cheek. She exhaled sharply. "Adrian?" His fingers brushed against her jaw. His voice was dark, dangerous. "You are my wife, Elena." Her pulse pounded. His gaze flickered to her lips. "You belong to me." And before she could stop him, he kissed her. It wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle, it was fire. Pure, unfiltered possession. A battle of dominance, of anger, of something neither of them could name. Eleanor's fingers fisted into his shirt, Adrian's hands pressed into her lower back. And for a moment, the world disappeared. There was no contract. There was no cold arrangement. Just them. And the inescapable truth that neither of them wanted to face. That this marriage wasn't just a contract anymore. Adrian pulled away first. His chest rose and fell heavily. His lips were still inches from hers, and his eyes, they were filled with something dark, raw, unspoken. Eleanor was breathless, but before she could say anything, he let her go, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just shattered every rule between them. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing there, heart racing, lips tingling, and completely, utterly lost. Adrian Knight had spent his entire life building walls. Walls to keep control, walls to protect himself from feeling, walls to remind himself that love was a weakness. But now, every time he looked at Elena Carter, he felt his walls crumbling, and it terrified him, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to stop it. After that kiss, Eleanor stopped trying, stopped waiting for Adrian to acknowledge what was between them, stopped hoping. She told herself she was done. But at night, when she was alone in that massive empty house, she missed him. She missed the way his presence commanded the room. She missed the way his voice sent shivers down her spine. She missed the way, just for a second, he had looked at her like she was his entire world. But it didn't matter. Because Adrian Knight had made his choice, and she wasn't part of it. Elena thought the past was behind them, but she was wrong, because Vanessa Green was back. And this time, she wasn't just here to watch, she was here to win. Elena saw her first, standing in the grand living room, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor. Dressed in all black, a smirk playing on her lips. "Darling," Vanessa purred. "I didn't realize you were still here." Elena clenched her jaw. "What do you want?" Vanessa tilted her head, a mocking glint in her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, I thought you knew by now." She turned, and that's when Elena saw him. Adrian, standing in the doorway, silent, watching. And for the first time in weeks, his face was unreadable, like he already knew what was coming. And he didn't know how to stop it. Vanessa turned back to Eleanor, her smirk deepening. "Poor little Eleanor," she said, crossing her arms. "Did he tell you?" Eleanor's chest tightened. "Tell me what?" Vanessa sighed dramatically. "You really think Adrian married you out of love?" she whispered. "That's adorable." Elena's heart pounded. She knew their marriage had started as a contract. She knew Adrian never intended to love her. But now, looking into Vanessa's cruel, triumphant eyes, she knew there was more. Vanessa stepped forward. He married you because I made him. Eleanor's breath hitched. What? Vanessa's smirk deepened. Oh, sweetheart, I gave him a choice. Marry me or destroy his company. A sharp, painful silence filled the room. Eleanor turned to Adrian. He didn't say a word, didn't deny it, didn't fight it. And that silence shattered her. Eleanor's vision blurred. This entire time, Adrian had a choice, and he still chose her. Not because he wanted to, not because he loved her, but because she was the lesser evil. Her hands shook. She laughed bitterly. So I was just an escape plan? Adrian finally spoke. Eleanor! She stepped back, her voice cold. Don't. He clenched his fists. You don't understand. Then make me understand, Adrian, she snapped, tears burning in her eyes. Silence. Nothing. Because there was nothing he could say to fix this. Eleanor turned to leave, but before she could take another step, Adrian grabbed her wrist. The moment his skin touched hers, a shiver ran down her spine. Elena, please, he whispered. And for the first time, Adrian Knight looked defeated, like he was terrified of losing her, like she was his last piece of sanity, but she ripped her hand away and whispered, You don't get to want me only when it's convenient. Then she walked away. And this time, Adrian didn't stop her. Adrian Knight had lost deals. He had lost battles. He had lost control. But nothing had ever hurt like losing her. He sat in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him, staring at the city skyline. And for the first time in his life, he felt hollow. Because Elena Carter had walked away. And for the first time in his life, Adrian realized he couldn't live without her. Adrian Knight had spent his life winning. Winning in business, winning in power, winning in control. But when Elena Carter walked away, for the first time, he had lost. And it felt like the end of everything. Days passed, then weeks, and Adrian did nothing. He buried himself in work, ignored the emptiness of his massive, cold mansion, told himself this was for the best, that Eleanor had always been temporary. But late at night, when he reached for her in his sleep, only to find an empty bed, he realized she wasn't temporary. She had become everything. Eleanor had left him. She had walked away. But why did it still hurt? She told herself she was done, that Adrian Knight was just a mistake. But every time she closed her eyes, she remembered his touch, his voice, the way he had looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. And worst of all, the way he hadn't stopped her from leaving. If he had just asked her to stay, would she have? She didn't want to think about it, but her heart, it already knew the answer. Adrian had spent his entire life running from emotions. But now he was running straight into them, because losing her was worse than any fear he'd ever had. And he was done pretending. He had to fight for her, even if it meant breaking every rule he had ever lived by. Before he could get Eleanor back, there was one last battle to fight, and Vanessa Green was waiting. Adrian stormed into her office, slamming the door behind him. She looked up, smirking. Darling, to what do I owe the pleasure? His voice was ice. You're done. Her smirk faltered. Excuse me? Adrian's eyes were deadly. I let you play your games. I let you think you had control. But this... He stepped closer. This ends now. Vanessa tilted her head. You wouldn't dare. I already have. His lips curled into a cruel smile. I've bought out your father's company. By tomorrow, the Green family empire will be dust. Vanessa's face paled. You don't ever come near me again, he said, voice lethal, and stay the hell away from Eleanor. Then he turned and walked away. Because now, there was only one thing left to do. Get her back. It was raining when he found her. The city streets were slick with water, the night air cold. And Elena Carter was standing in the rain, looking more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. His chest tightened, because for the first time, he felt fear. Not fear of losing control, but fear of losing her forever. Elena. She turned, eyes widening when she saw him. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, she looked away. Adrian's heart dropped, but he didn't stop. He stepped closer. I need to talk to you. Elena crossed her arms, her voice cold. We have nothing left to say. He exhaled sharply. That's not true. Silence. Then, her voice broke. Why are you here, Adrian? He clenched his jaw, and then he said the words he had never said before. Because I love you. Elena froze. Her breath hitched. She had imagined him saying those words 1,000 times, but never like this. Never so raw, never so broken. She shook her head. No. No, you don't. Adrian stepped closer, his hands shaking. I do. His voice cracked. I was too afraid to say it before, but I love you, Elena. Tears burned in her eyes. You hurt me, Adrian. He swallowed hard. I know. His voice was hoarse. And I will spend my whole life making up for it, if you let me. Her chest ached, because she wanted to believe him, but she was so afraid. What if I can't? She whispered. Adrian's gaze softened. Then I'll wait. Her breath shuddered, because she knew. Adrian Knight never waited for anything, but for her, he would wait forever. She stepped closer, and he held his breath. Then, she kissed him. Software slow, like she was memorizing him. And just like that, the war was over, because this time, they were both all in, together, forever. Adrian Knight had once believed love was a weakness, that it was something he could live without, that it was something he could control. But when Elena Carter kissed him back, when she chose him again despite all the pain, he knew. Love wasn't a weakness, it was his greatest strength. And now he was never letting her go again. It should have been enough. The way Elena forgave him, the way she chose him despite everything, the way she finally saw the love he had spent so long denying. But Adrian Knight, he never did things halfway. So a few days later, under the soft glow of city lights, he did something he never thought he'd do. He got down on one knee. Elena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Adrian, what are you doing? His heart pounded, because for the first time, he was terrified of the answer. Elena, he said, voice raw, I married you once without love. She blinked, her breath hitching. But this time, he opened a velvet box, inside a simple, elegant diamond ring. This time I'm asking you to marry me for real. Tears filled her eyes. He exhaled shakily. I love you, he whispered, and I want forever with you. Silence stretched between them, a heartbeat, a lifetime. Then, she dropped to her knees, threw her arms around him and whispered, yes. It was different this time. The first time they got married, it was a deal, a business transaction, a way for Adrian to escape a fate he didn't want. But this time, it was love. Eleanor stood in a white silk gown, her heart racing as she walked down the aisle. Adrian stood at the altar, watching her like she was his entire world, because she was, because she always had been. And when they finally stood before each other, there was no hesitation, no doubt, just two people who had fought every battle and won. Adrian took her hands, his voice steady, filled with emotion. Elena, I never believed in love until I met you. Her lips trembled. You changed me, he whispered. You broke down my walls. You taught me what it means to fight for something real. A tear slipped down her cheek. And I swear, he continued, his voice cracking, for the rest of my life, I will love you with everything I have. Eleanor took a deep, shaky breath. I never thought I'd find someone like you, she whispered. I never thought love was meant for me. Adrian swallowed hard. But you proved me wrong, she continued. And I swear, I will spend the rest of my life choosing you. Every day. Always. Adrian's grip on her hands tightened, and when the officiant finally said the words, "You may now kiss the bride," Adrian didn't wait. He pulled her close, and he kissed her like it was the first time, like it was the last time, like it was forever, because this time, it really was. 1 year later, the mansion wasn't cold anymore, the rooms weren't empty, and the bed was no longer lonely. Adrian woke up to Eleanor curled against him, her soft breathing warming his skin. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Once he had thought love was a distraction. Now it was his reason for everything. And as she stirred, blinking up at him with sleepy eyes, he whispered, "I love you, Mrs. Knight." She smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I love you more, Mr. Knight." And just like that, their love story was never supposed to happen. But it was always meant to be.